you choose to give up rather than live? Is this truly your desire? That is a disappointment. Please excuse me.
If only it were that simple. So, Devil Survivor 2 was a game I liked, all things considered. It had its issues, but I had fun replaying it to get footage for my last video. The same could not be said for the second campaign of the 3DS re-release, the Triangulum arc. Gameplay-wise, it was fine, but I didn't make a 73-minute video on Devil Survivor 2's gameplay. I talked about its writing, and the writing in the Triangulum arc is so bad that it makes the writing of the neutral route look passable. If you haven't watched my previous video, please do so, as this is a sequel to that video covering the follow-up story of Devil Survivor 2's plot. It feels kind of awkward making a video on a story that I so thoroughly hate, as I try to find the best in what I talk about, but since I made a to-be-continued joke at the end of the last video, I've kind of locked myself into this. Fortunately, there are aspects of this story that I think are worth discussing, as the Triangulum arc is a textbook example of the kinds of terrible writing tropes that can go into poorly thought-out sequels, and if nothing else, it expands on a theme present in the previous campaign's neutral ending. So without further ado, let's talk about how a story that opposed change turned into one that feared change. Yeah, no, I'm not doing the day transition thing. The Triangulum arc doesn't deserve it. Remember how, in my last video, I said the story of Devil Survivor 2 wasted no time getting into its apocalypse? Well, the Triangulum arc follows a similar trend by wasting no time in showing how awful the story is going to be. As early as the opening cutscene, I knew the Triangulum arc was going to be a problem. You're told that in the previous story, or the Septentrion arc as I'll be referring to it going forward, you made the decision to side with Daichi and recruited everyone, including Psyduke, to overthrow Polaris and return the world to the way it was before the apocalypse. Yes, I am aware this was something I suggested in the previous video when I said it probably would have been better if Psyduke combined with the neutral routes, given that all the neutral routes are awful, and replacing the non-existent philosophy of the neutrals with Psyduke's philosophy. But I didn't think or really want them to actually do it. To give the Triangulum arc the slightest bit of credit, this version of the neutral ending does erase one of the lingering problems that returning the world to the status quo had last time. In the Septentrion arc, it was a bit ridiculous to think that even if the survivors of the apocalypse regained their memories when the world regressed, they'd be able to change the whole of humanity and redeem them in Polaris' eyes. In the Triangulum arc, we don't need to worry about her deciding to eradicate humanity because she's dead. Unfortunately, that's the best I can say about it because, for one, all the other problems of returning the world to the status quo that I outlined from the previous video still applies, and two, this is telling you that if you chose an ending other than Daichi's, then you made the wrong choice. I know I went on a rant in the last video about how the neutral ending is presented as the canon one, but this is on a whole new level of awfulness because at least before you could choose another path anyway. In the Triangulum arc, however, the game will act like you realized that killing Polaris and returning the world to the status quo was such an obviously good idea, even if you don't believe that, and what's worse is how unwilling the game is to seriously criticize the status quo. Early on, the characters wonder if the apocalypse is happening again because humanity failed to grow, but instead of contemplating what went wrong and trying to improve, the Triangulum arc doubles down and says no, humanity is great, actually. We shouldn't wonder if we're doing something wrong when every celestial and divine being that comes to Earth decides we're a cancer that must be eradicated. In fact, humanity as a whole is so good that if every single person at once was able to influence how the world would be, they'd make the exact same world we already live in. That's just how good the status quo is. For the record, I don't like the idea of humanity being killed, and I'm generally against others arbitrating who lives and dies, but the idea of change is something the Triangulum arc is just so terrified of. In fact, it's so afraid of change they weren't even willing to change the plot's structure. In this story, you fight the Triangulum, which, like the Septentrion, are a bunch of abstract shape monsters that show up once a day but are totally different from the Septentrion. These ones are a much bigger threat because... Well, the characters say they're more powerful, and that's just as good as showing, am I right? What makes this worse is that the game decides to inject power creep by making the big bad of this story Canopus, who's essentially just Polaris, but bigger and scarier. Ooh! This is one of the many things the Triangulum arc does which can only be described as lazy writing. So much of the Triangulum arc is either copying what happened in the Septentrion arc, down to having the characters' fate ranks boil down to, remember when I had character development? That was nice. Or having the most hammed up fan service possible in ways that make everyone in the world seem brain dead. For example, at the end of the second day, you get captured by Gyps for learning too much about their secrets, only for the members of Gyps in your friend group to break you out. After escaping, you meet up with Ronaldo and decide to take over a Gyps base because he did that in the Septentrion arc. Do you remember? Do you remember Ronaldo taking over the Nagoya branch of Gyps? Because the writers don't seem to remember why Ronaldo took over a Gyps branch. In the Septentrion arc, taking over a Gyps branch served several strategic purposes, such as weakening Gyps, securing supplies for civilians, and having a base of operations for the rioters to stay safe and strategize. In the Triangulum arc, you just take over a Gyps branch because you wanted one. You're told it would somehow be efficient to overrun an entire military compound so that 11 people can oppose the new Gyps. Even though it would make way more sense if you kept a low profile instead of weakening an organization whose goals you ostensibly agree with. It would have been so easy and made way more sense if Ronaldo was the one trying to break you out here as opposed to your Gyps friends who were for some reason not being monitored, but instead you escape with no trouble and decide to go back to the group you escaped from because you were unwilling to go one night without your precious beds. Reusing the antagonists of the Septentrion arc, power creeping them, and having this illogical fan service is already pretty bad, but the presentation and execution of this story is worse too. In the Triangulum arc, instead of focusing on ideological and political conflicts, the game decides to focus on how much of a gosh darn meanie the new character, Miyako Hotsuin, is. That's right, we have a new character who shares the last name and aesthetics of everyone's favorite authoritarian twink, and apparently we're supposed to think this new Hotsuin is so much worse than Yamato. Miyako is introduced as an enigma. After the first of the Triangulum fucks up Japan, you and your party try to meet up with your old friends, but you find out that 1. No one remembers what happened in the Septentrion arc, so we get a lovely flashback every time we re-recruit an old character, and that Saiduk and Yamato are missing. Saiduk being missing isn't as much of a surprise as one might expect, given that he can disappear and reappear at will, so tracking him is damn near impossible, although his absence is enough to tell us that he's in trouble. Yamato being missing, on the other hand, is a bit more distressing because aside from his Dragon Stream powers, he's a completely normal human, so he has to be somewhere. What makes his disappearance more odd is that there is a Chief Hotsuin leading Gyps, and it's the aforementioned Miyako. Early on, it's established that Miyako operates very differently from her meritocratic counterpart. For one, she believes that all human lives are equal. Yeah, talk about humans in the third person, very subtle. And unlike Yamato, she is explicitly a utilitarian. If you need a reminder, utilitarianism is the philosophy that the ethical thing to do is whatever maximizes the well-being of the most amount of people. It's because of this mentality that she also subscribes to the belief that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and with this series' track record, you can probably see where this is going. Miyako is characterized as someone who is simultaneously untrustworthy and secretive, but also a good person who tries to do too much on her own. The writers have a tough balancing act with this character because they want her to be a sympathetic antagonist who eventually sees the error of her ways, but unfortunately, since this is the Triangulum arc, it all comes crashing down. To understand why, we need to look at the character arc, if you can even call it that, of Makoto. Makoto suffered heavily in the transition between arcs. In the Septentrion arc, she was one of the better characters and had a nice little arc about learning to be her own person and not emotionlessly follow orders. It wasn't anything stellar, but it was a functioning arc. This time around, Makoto's central role is to misunderstand the trolley problem. If you're unaware, the trolley problem is a thought experiment that asks its participants to imagine a scenario where a trolley is going down some tracks, and there are 5 or so people down the line who will be killed if it keeps going. But you're near a switch that can change the tracks, and doing so will send it down a track with one person who will die instead. There are a lot of questions that this thought experiment asks of its participants. Is it okay to kill someone in the name of saving more people? Do you have a moral responsibility to save someone just because you can? And is choosing to let people die the same as killing them? Or to put it another way, are you as responsible for your inactions as you are for the actions you take? Individually, all of these questions might be easy to answer when not being applied to a scenario like this. After all, if you see a kid dangling over a cliff and you could help them with no risk to yourself but you abandon them, then that's not too different from killing them. Miyako uses this example as the basis for her philosophy, and as a utilitarian, she falls into the kill the one to save the many camp. But the writers have a different opinion. They think the correct answer is to find a way to save the people on both tracks. Yeah, about that last sentence. After combing through the footage, I've realized that this isn't strictly speaking true. The conclusion to Makoto's character arc does acknowledge the fact that sacrifices might sometimes be necessary, but it's important to try and save everyone we can anyway. This is a point I generally agree with, and as a result, I have to concede that Makoto's character arc wasn't handled as badly as I initially thought. That being said, I'm going to leave the section going forward mostly unchanged, because for one, even though it's not as stupid as I might make it sound, it's still not being handled in a very interesting way, and part of that section is leading into a story that I think handles a similar idea in a much more effective manner. But yeah, I just wanted to add this disclaimer that Makoto's character arc isn't as stupid as I might make it seem, and that I don't even necessarily agree with the trolley problem as like a helpful way of viewing the world, but feel the Triangulum arc engages with it in a disingenuous way. So back to the video. When Makoto comes to this conclusion after talking to various characters, she tells Miyako that she'd find a way to save everyone, which is extremely childish and misses the point of the trolley problem. The writers present this, like they do with all neutral answers, as a clever solution you reach by thinking outside the box, when this is more along the lines of saying, I don't want to think about the question because both answers are bad. Unfortunately, there are times when you have to make decisions where there might not be a good answer, and if you spend all your time looking for a mythical better solution, you might end up letting the worst case scenario happen. Now, I'm not arguing that we should just accept bad realities and that we should never strive for better outcomes, but this is going a little too far in the other direction. The trolley problem is used to make you think about how you view the world and how you would handle difficult situations. What the writers have done is try to take the thought experiment literally when it was never meant to be taken that way, and give the answer that's obviously ideal but misses the point. If saving all the people without making any sacrifices was an option, then of course everyone would do it. The trolley problem isn't that the trolley will run over 6 people and if you change it, it'll run over no one, because that's not an interesting ethical question. I understand that they're trying to say that there's always a better solution, and that we shouldn't settle for the lesser of two evils, but if trying to pursue a better alternative fails and we get an overall worse outcome, we implicitly helped that outcome occur, which is something the game doesn't even try to acknowledge. An example of a story that handles a similar idea in a more mature way is Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Skip to the timecode here if you don't want spoilers, and there will be major spoilers. Towards the end of the show, one of the protagonists, Alphonse Elric, is using the power of a Philosopher's Stone to fight back against his more powerful opponents. One of said opponents, a man named Kimberly, asks him why he doesn't just run away and use it to get his body back, as that was the end goal of his journey. Al tells him that he doesn't want to use this stone, which is made of living humans, for such a selfish reason, and instead wants to use their life force to save the country from total destruction. Kimberly sees this as him giving up on getting his body back in order to save the country, but Al rejects this. He doesn't think it's right that he should have to choose between saving the people he loves and getting his body back. He wants to overcome one of the fundamental rules of the show, the law of equivalent exchange, and find a way to get his body back through different means and save the people of the country. On paper, this statement isn't too different from Makoto's claim that she'd find a way to save people on both tracks, but there are two very important differences. One is that, unlike the hypothetical used in the Triangulum arc, here we see Al putting his beliefs into practice and, very importantly, despite wanting his body back, prioritizing his combat capabilities for the good of the majority rather than trying to pursue both of his objectives at the same time. He is putting the needs of the many over his own needs, but not abandoning hope for his needs. The other very important difference is what Kimberly points out. If he wants to pursue the goal of saving the country and getting his body back, he must accept the possibility of total failure, that he won't save the nation or get his body back. In a lesser story, I might say a threat like this means very little, but Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is not a lesser story. Towards the end, the main villain achieves his goal and hundreds of thousands of people lose their souls. You'll have to watch for yourself to see what happens if you ignored my spoiler warning, but the point is that this is how you handle the idea of taking a risk to get the best outcome. You need to make the risk of failure feel real. I brought all of this up because Makoto's arc is a microcosm of the main conflict with Miyako. Miyako's plan involves sacrificing everyone in your party in order to make Saiduk strong enough to protect humanity from invaders like the Triangulum. Naturally, your party would rather not die, and given that this version of your party unanimously agreed with Daichi, they all search for a better solution that requires no sacrifices. Now, as it turns out, for convenient jargon plot reasons, her plan actually sucks even if we do go along with it, which is meant to validate a player's decision to oppose her, but in reality all it does is weaken the criticism of utilitarianism. The main theme of Miyako's role in the story is to reject the premise that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. This is why many characters are shown to be uncomfortable with Miyako's cold and emotionless decision-making. Well, they say she's emotionless, but really, Miyako seems like a sympathy-driven person. Prioritizing the safety of as many people as possible isn't a hard decision for her as it is for many other characters, but she doesn't want to leave people to die. Makoto remarks that Miyako will always save the majority first and then will try to save those left behind, and if that's how Miyako operates, what's wrong with her? The message the Triangulum arc seems to be pushing is that utilitarianism is wrong and that you can't just reduce humans to numbers, but they don't actually show that in a compelling way. This is a problem with a lot of stories that want to criticize utilitarianism. Instead of showing something fundamentally flawed with the ideology, they just show a supposedly utilitarian character doing utilitarianism wrong. To use the trolley problem as an example, if saving everyone and letting no one die was an option, that's what a utilitarian would do. By showing a utilitarian character's plan to be wrong for technical reasons, it doesn't actually show utilitarianism is flawed. The Triangulum arc is even worse about it than other stories because one of the endings is just Miyako's plan without the technical flaw. What's worse is how the game goes on a crusade about how we shouldn't sacrifice anyone when sacrifices happen all the time throughout the game. Whether anyone likes it or not, civilians die in this apocalypse, but because they're faceless NPCs, no one cares about them. For all the game's preaching of individualistic values and that everyone matters, the game only ever mentions the suffering of the masses in passing and frankly treats the billions dead as a statistic less significant than sacrificing yourself and your friends. I think the reason the game hates utilitarianism so much is because many see utilitarianism as antithetical to individualism. Valuing the needs of the most amount of people, or the collective, sounds too egalitarian and makes individualists feel like they're not so special. To be fair, no one is truly 100% individualistic or collectivist. We all hold values from both mentalities, and having a firm rejection of one will lead to a poisoned worldview. You'd think a series like Devil Survivor, which often pushes forth the values of balance and neutrality, would understand this, but neutrality in this series, and really Shin Megami Tensei as a whole, doesn't often care about balance. They care about the status quo. If we followed utilitarian thinking, would we want to radically change society? Maybe if we were willing to think less about ourselves as individuals and more as members of a community, maybe we'd be able to overcome social issues of all stripes. If we stopped obsessing over individualism at every opportunity, maybe we'd be able to think about and address the horrible reality we live in, where people, even within first world nations like Japan and the United States, suffer from inequality, discrimination, economic hardships, and health issues, both physical and mental. Individualism has its place in society, but exclusively focusing on it is a way to make people blind to the suffering around them because, as an individual, your life is pretty good, so why would you actively make it worse by acknowledging suffering for the sake of a collective? I think I'm going to end the video here because there isn't that much that's meaningful to say in this story. In the first draft of this script, I talked about how most of the characters were either sidelined or outright ruined, such as Joe becoming a generic comedic relief character with no depth, or Ronaldo going back to being a goddamn cop. But in the face of the depressing existence of the Triangulum arc, it just seems like a nitpick. The game does a lot wrong with its characters, writing, and endings, but what do you want me to say? The true ending is returning the world to the status quo, and that's somehow presented as the riskiest ending and is cringe? I've tread over that ground before, just like how the Triangulum arc has tread over this story before. For all of its faults, it felt like the story of the Septentrion arc tried to do something different. It shot itself in the foot a few times along the way, but it wanted to tell a story that at least flirted with some interesting ideas. The Triangulum arc just doesn't do that. It tried to tell a completely safe story that wanted to keep player attention by having obnoxious fan service and artificially raising the stakes, and as a result, the story had no soul. I honestly don't know what else to say other than that the Triangulum arc is bad and you shouldn't play it. I'd like to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It certainly wasn't the most fun thing I've ever done, but I think it was a good learning experience, and one of the things I've learned is to not make videos on subjects that I hate. Despite how cynical I could be at times in my first 2 videos, I did genuinely have fun making them, and I have positive views on both of those games. Making a video on something I don't like wasn't very fun, and going forward, I think I'm just going to not cover topics if I think they're bad. I think there can be a lot of value in talking about things that are bad, but it's just not for me. I do have plans for several other videos going forward, so I hope you'll stick around and share my content with anyone who you think would like it. I'll see you next time.